The crisp autumn air of late October bit at the edges of their warmth, smelling sharply of pine needles and damp earth. For Mark Jenkins, a man of 42 whose face was a roadmap of laugh lines and sun-weathered patience, this was paradise. He moved with a practiced economy, driving a tent stake into the stubborn ground with a single fluid motion. Beside him, 10-year-old Leo, a miniature version of his father with the same intense blue eyes, struggled to unfold a map, his brow furrowed in concentration. This annual trip to Yellowstone was more than a tradition. It was a sacred ritual. It was where Mark taught his son not just how to survive in the wild, but how to listen to it. "The compass points north, Dad, but the mountains tell you where you really are," Leo recited, a phrase he'd heard a dozen times, his voice full of a proud, earnest seriousness that made Mark's heart swell. Their world for the week was a small clearing, a pocket of civilization carved into the immense breathing wilderness. The two-person tent, a familiar shade of forest green, stood as their humble fortress against the sprawling landscape of towering lodgepole pines and distant snow-dusted peaks. Inside, sleeping bags were already unfurled, a comic book peeking out from Leo's. Outside, their gear was meticulously organized, a compact cooking stove, two well-worn backpacks leaning against a fallen log, and a pair of binoculars that were almost permanently affixed to Leo's neck. Mark's daily routine was a simple, comforting loop, waking before dawn to the sound of a distant elk bugle, brewing coffee over a low flame, and charting their day's hike, while Leo excitedly pointed out every squirrel and blue jay, cataloging them in a small, dog-eared notebook. Before they set off for the trail leading to a scenic overlook, the satellite phone crackled to life, a fragile tether to the world they had left behind. Sarah's voice, warm but distant through the static, filled the small space between them. "Did you remember to pack the extra waterproof matches?" she asked, a familiar maternal worry that transcended the hundreds of miles. Mark chuckled, glancing at Leo, who was tracing their intended path on the map. "We've got it all covered, Sar. Leo's my expert navigator." There was a pause, a crackle of space, and then her final words, laced with a love so palpable it seemed to warm the air. "I love you both. Be safe." Mark disconnected the call, the silence of the wilderness rushing back in to fill the void, the two words hanging between them like a fragile promise against the vast, indifferent landscape. The ascent began with a shared sense of exhilaration, the trail winding upward through a cathedral of ancient pines. Sunlight, crisp and golden, filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Leo, a few paces ahead, was a whirlwind of youthful energy, pointing out a Steller's jay with a flash of iridescent blue and dutifully noting it in his journal. Mark followed at a more measured pace, the familiar weight of his pack a comforting presence. He watched his son, a profound sense of peace settling over him. This, he thought, was what mattered: the clean scent of pine, the solid earth beneath his boots, and the bright, unblemished joy on Leo's face as he navigated their shared adventure. The change was subtle at first, a whisper of a shift in the atmosphere, that Mark, with his years of experience, felt in his bones before he could see it. The wind, which had been a gentle caress, began to carry a sharper, more insistent edge, moaning through the high branches of the lodgepoles. The sky, a vast canvas of cerulean blue just an hour before, started to curdle, streaks of slate gray bleeding in from the western horizon. Mark paused, pulling his collar tighter around his neck. "Looks like some weather's rolling in, buddy," he said, his voice carefully casual. Leo looked up, his brow furrowing as he noticed the dimming light, the earlier warmth seeming to drain from the air around them. Within minutes, the trail grew less distinct, the familiar markers and worn earth blending into the deepening gloom. At a fork, where a weathered sign pointed in two directions, Mark hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The map felt flimsy and inadequate in his hands as he tried to reconcile its neat lines with the increasingly hostile landscape. The mountains, once a clear guide, were now shrouded in a thick rolling mist. Leo, sensing his father's unease, grew quiet, his hand instinctively finding the fabric of Mark's jacket. The immense wilderness, which had felt like a welcoming embrace, now seemed to press in on them, its silence heavy and watchful, a vast, indifferent entity. Suddenly a sound shattered the tense quiet, the sharp, percussive crack of a heavy branch snapping in the dense woods just off the trail. It was too loud for a deer, too sudden for a falling limb. Both Mark and Leo froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the noise. Mark's hand shot out, a silent command for his son to stay behind him, as he scanned the impenetrable wall of trees and undergrowth. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his practiced calm. The forest, which had been a symphony of small sounds, fell utterly silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. All that remained was the rising howl of the wind and the frantic hammering beat of his own heart. The first snowflake was a shock, a single wet flake melting on Mark's cheek. It was followed by another, then a dozen, then a blinding curtain of white. An early snowstorm, unforecasted, aggressive, and deadly. A cold dread, far colder than the plunging temperature, seized Mark. They were not equipped for this. Their light jackets were meant for a crisp autumn day, not a blizzard. "We have to go back," he yelled over the wind, his voice tight with a panic he fought to conceal. "Now!" He grabbed Leo's hand, his mind racing. But as he turned, he saw that their tracks, their only guide back to safety, were already vanishing under a rapidly thickening blanket of snow. They plunged through the disorienting swirl of white, the world reduced to a maelstrom of snow and wind. Mark held Leo's hand in a death grip, his knuckles a stark white against the graying light. He shouted words of encouragement, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt, but the storm tore them from his lips and flung them into the void. Leo, his small face streaked with a mixture of snow and tears, stumbled on an unseen route. As Mark pulled him back to his feet, the boy's gaze shot past his father's shoulder, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure horror that was swallowed by the gale, leaving only the image of his fear hanging in the air as the snow consumed them. 4 years is an eternity and no time at all. For Sarah Jenkins, time had fractured on that snowy October day, shattering into two distinct realities, the sun-drenched, vibrant world before and the silent, gray expanse of the after. Her house became a shrine to a life abruptly paused. Leo's bedroom remained a perfect, heartbreaking diorama of a 10-year-old boy's world. A half-finished model of the solar system sat on his desk, Jupiter's great red spot meticulously painted, its moons waiting in a small plastic tray. Clothes for the day he was supposed to return from his trip were still folded neatly on his chair. Sarah moved through these rooms like a ghost, the silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight pressing down on her, the air thick with unspoken words and memories. The grief was a living entity, a shapeshifter. Some mornings it was a dull, leaden ache in her bones, a simple exhaustion that made the act of breathing a conscious effort. On other days it was a sharp, violent predator, ambushing her with a memory triggered by the scent of pine from a neighbor's yard or the sight of a father and son playing catch in the park. This was the unique torture of ambiguous loss, the lack of a grave to visit, of a final story to tell. Hope, that cruelest of emotions, would flicker within her, a tiny defiant flame in a hurricane of despair. It whispered to her in the dead of night that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way to survive. Living off the grid, a fantasy she knew was insane, but clung to with a desperate primal need. Her life became a singular, obsessive mission. The official case file, now inches thick and gathering dust in a ranger station, was labeled inactive. But for Sarah, the search never ended. She poured her pain and dwindling savings into a website, Yellowstone's Missing, the Jenkins Story. It was a digital ghost, filled with smiling photos of Mark and Leo, maps of the search area, and her own pleas for information. She spent hours moderating the comments, filtering through the compassionate messages from strangers and the vile, baseless theories from online trolls. This digital vigil was her only weapon against the encroaching silence, a constant scream into a void that rarely screamed back, a testament that they were not forgotten. In the quiet moments, her mind would betray her, replaying memories with a cinematic, torturous clarity. She remembered the morning they left, the air crisp with the promise of adventure. Mark was double-checking the straps on Leo's new backpack, his large, capable hands dwarfed by the small blue pack. Leo was vibrating with excitement, peppering his father with questions about bears and geysers. "Mom will bring you back a real pine cone, a giant one," he'd yelled, his face beaming as he climbed into the car. Sarah had laughed, kissed them both, and watched them drive away. She clung to that final image, not of fear or panic, but of pure, unadulterated joy. That memory was both a comfort and a dagger to the heart. Each autumn she made the same solemn pilgrimage back to Yellowstone, a ritual of self-inflicted pain and desperate hope. The majestic peaks that once inspired awe now felt like monolithic tombstones, their beauty a mocking reminder of what they had taken from her. She would drive the familiar roads to the trailhead, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles were white. She'd walk the perimeter of the parking lot, tacking up new laminated flyers with photos of Mark and Leo, their faces smiling out at a world that had moved on. She never hiked the trails. The thought of walking in their final footsteps was an agony she couldn't bear. Instead, she just watched the trees, her gaze sweeping the dense forest as if she could somehow will them to walk out. The park rangers had grown accustomed to her visits. Lead Ranger Thompson, a man whose face was as weathered as the park's ancient trees, would meet her with a sad, familiar kindness. Their conversations were brief, a script they both knew by heart. "Anything, Dave?" she'd ask, her voice thin. He would shake his head, his eyes full of a pity she hated, but understood. "Nothing new, Sarah. We still keep our eyes open on patrols. We haven't forgotten." His words were meant to be a comfort, but they only reinforced the vastness of the wilderness and the futility of her quest. The system had done all it could. She was now a lonely satellite, orbiting a tragedy that the rest of the world had accepted as a closed chapter. Sometimes, sitting in her rental car and staring at the vast, indifferent landscape, she would allow the anger to surface. It was a hot, cleansing rage directed at the mountains, at the sudden storm, at Mark for his confidence, and even at herself for letting them go. Was this devotion, or was it a slow, deliberate form of self-destruction? Was she honoring their memory by keeping the search alive, or was she simply refusing to live the life she had been left with? The questions circled in her mind, a relentless carousel of doubt and guilt. She would talk to them, her words whispered against the glass. "Where are you? Just give me a sign. Anything." But the only answer was the mournful cry of the wind through the lodgepole pines. The drive home was always the worst part, each mile putting more distance between her and the last place her family had been alive. She would watch Yellowstone shrink in her rearview mirror until it was just a jagged line on the horizon, a scar against the sky. The hope, so fragile and foolish, would recede, replaced by the familiar ache of reality. Yet, as she crossed back into the mundane world of traffic lights and strip malls, the resolve would harden within her once more. The search wasn't just a series of actions. It was who she was now. It was the promise she had made to the silence, the one thing the wilderness could not take from her. She would not stop, not until she had an answer. Ben Carter had fished this particular cove on Yellowstone Lake for over 50 years, a secluded inlet far from the tourist-clogged arteries of the park. At 73, his movements were a study in patient economy, the flick of his wrist sending the lure arcing through the crisp morning air with a familiar, satisfying whisper. The water was glass, reflecting the stoic, pine-studded mountains, and a sky of pale, cloudless blue. He wasn't fishing for sport or sustenance, but for the profound silence, the feeling of being a small, quiet part of something immense. On his third cast, the line went taut with a sudden, jarring thud. It wasn't the lively tug of a trout, but a dead, unyielding weight, a snag. Annoyed, he began the tedious process of reeling in what he assumed was a waterlogged branch. The resistance was peculiar. It wasn't the rigid stubbornness of a rock or the tangled mess of a submerged tree limb. There was a strange, heavy give to it, a sodden drag that fought him with the passive weight of a drowned thing. Ben grunted, his old shoulders straining as he worked the reel, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy shore. He planted his feet, leaning back and pulling with a steady, rhythmic pressure born of decades of experience. Slowly, agonizingly, the thing began to move through the murky water toward him. A trail of disturbed silt followed its path. As it broke the surface just a few feet from the bank, he saw a flash of impossible color, a patch of bright, synthetic blue, a hue that had no place in this world of earthy greens and browns. With one final heave, he dragged the heavy mass onto the shore. The sucking sound of it releasing from the mud was the only noise in the quiet cove. It was a child's backpack, small and once a vibrant shade of sky blue, now muted by a thick coat of algae and dark, clinging silt. The fabric was waterlogged and heavy, but the shape was unmistakable, a ghostly echo of school hallways and playground laughter. A profound coldness, entirely unrelated to the morning chill, seeped into Ben's bones. He had lived near this park his entire life. He knew its stories, the tragedies it swallowed whole. He recognized this object not for what it was, but for what it represented, a question that had been screamed into the wilderness and, until now, had gone unanswered. His gnarled hands, accustomed to the slick skin of fish and the rough bark of trees, trembled as he reached for it. For a moment, a primal instinct urged him to push it back into the deep, to let the lake keep its secrets. The mountains held their silence for a reason. But then an image surfaced in his mind, a faded flyer tacked to the community board in town year after year. The smiling faces of a man and a young boy. Yellowstone's missing. He knew this wasn't just debris. It was a relic, a message in a bottle delivered 4 years too late. Someone, a mother or a wife, had spent every one of those years waiting. The weight on his line was nothing compared to the weight of that waiting. With a newfound sense of purpose, Ben knelt, his old knees protesting on the damp earth. He carefully laid the backpack on a large flat stone, treating it with the reverence of an archaeologist, unearthing a sacred artifact. His fingers, clumsy with a mixture of cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the main zipper. It was corroded and stiff, the metal teeth clogged with grit. He pulled harder, and with a grating screech that tore through the morning's tranquility, it gave way. Inside, the contents had mostly decomposed into a pulpy, unrecognizable sludge. Yet, amidst the decay, one object remained pristine, sealed within a small gray waterproof pouch. Its modern, synthetic material stood in stark defiance of the natural decomposition surrounding it, a small island of preservation in an ocean of loss. He gently lifted the pouch, his breath catching in his throat. It felt impossibly light, yet held an immense significance. Wiping a sleeve across its clear plastic window, he peered inside. There, nestled among the disintegrating folds of a paper map, was the dark, rectangular form of a digital camera. The small glass lens stared up at him, a single unblinking eye that had silently witnessed the end of a story. This was it, the black box, a perfect, terrible time capsule preserved by a thin layer of plastic and sheer chance. Ben knew with a chilling certainty that resonated deep in his soul that he was holding the ghost of that long-ago snowstorm. He had to get to the ranger station immediately. The silence of the cove no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, a day like any other in the 4-year-long winter of Sarah's life. The number was from Wyoming, a prefix that made her heart seize in her chest. It was Lead Ranger Thompson. His voice was steady, professional, but freighted with a careful gravity that was new. "Sarah," he began, and the lack of preamble was a warning shot. "An angler found something by the lake, a backpack, a small blue one." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, the linoleum floor suddenly cold and distant beneath her feet. Hope, the treacherous, long, dormant beast, uncoiled in her gut, a nauseating, painful sensation. It wasn't closure he was offering, not yet. It was a question, sharp and terrifying, pulled from the depths. The drive back to Yellowstone was a frantic, surreal pilgrimage through a landscape of ghosts. Every mile was a battle between the desperate, illogical fantasy that this was the prelude to a miracle and the cold, hard certainty that it was the epilogue to a tragedy. The familiar, majestic peaks of the Absaroka Range no longer looked like indifferent stone, but like silent, complicit witnesses. She saw Mark's face in the passing clouds, heard Leo's laughter on the wind, whistling past her window. The internal pressure was immense, a physical ache behind her ribs. For 4 years, she had been sustained by the thinnest sliver of ambiguity. Now, she was driving toward a truth that threatened to extinguish it completely, leaving her in either the darkness of grief or the blinding, impossible light of reunion. At the ranger station, the air was thick with unspoken sympathy. Ranger Thompson led her to a small, sterile office where the object sat on a metal table, a relic from another lifetime. It was Leo's backpack. The vibrant sky blue was now a bruised, mottled gray-green, stained with silt and time. A small, faded astronaut keychain, a gift from his last birthday, was still attached to a zipper. Sarah reached out a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. A sob, raw and guttural, tore from her throat. It was the first tangible piece of her son she had touched in 1,160 days. The smell of lake water and decay rose from it. The scent of the wilderness that had swallowed her family, a smell she knew would haunt her forever. Thompson gave her a moment before gently explaining the next stage. "There was a camera inside, Sarah, in a waterproof pouch." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The good news is," the pouch held. "The bad news is the memory card has significant water damage. We can't access it here. We've sent it to a federal forensics lab in Bozeman. They're the best, but there are no guarantees." The information was a cruel twist of the knife. The answer was right there, a tiny black square of plastic, but it was locked away behind a wall of corrupted data. Another weight. A new, more potent form of limbo. She was suspended between the tangible evidence on the table and the invisible silent story, trapped within the damaged electronics. She checked into a small, anonymous motel just outside the park's west entrance, the floral bedspread and cheap art a bizarre backdrop to the monumental weight of her vigil. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind became a frantic projection room, cycling through endless scenarios. She imagined photos of their smiling faces on the trail, followed by images of the storm rolling in. Then the real would turn darker, conjuring the horrors she had suppressed for years: fear, injury, a dark shape in the woods. Was it better for the card to be unrecoverable, leaving her with the ambiguous hope she had learned to live with? Or was any truth, no matter how horrific, better than the endless aching void of not knowing? The pressure was a physical force pressing in on her from the thin motel walls. Miles away, in a quiet, climate-controlled lab, a forensic technician named Anya worked with the patience of a watchmaker. Under the powerful lens of a digital microscope, the memory card's delicate connectors looked like a ruined cityscape. She initiated a painstaking chip-off recovery, a process of surgically removing the memory chip and reading the raw data directly. For hours, the only sounds were the soft hum of the equipment and the occasional click of her keyboard. Corrupted data streamed across her monitor, a meaningless jumble of code. Then, a flicker. A partial image file began to resolve itself, a fragment of a green pine bough against a darkening gray sky. It was the first ghost from the machine, a digital echo confirming that a story was indeed waiting to be told. 2 days later, the phone rang again. Sarah snatched it from the bedside table, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Thompson. His voice was low, stripped of all professional detachment. "Sarah, they did it," he said, and she could hear the weariness and wonder in his tone. "They recovered files, photos, and a few short video clips. They're mostly intact." The air left her lungs in a rush. This was it. The waiting was over. The questions that had defined her existence for 4 years were about to be answered. "You can come view them whenever you're ready," Thompson added softly. Ready? How could anyone ever be ready to witness the last moments of their own world? She found herself back in the small office at the ranger station. The backpack was gone, replaced by a laptop on the metal table. The screen was dark, a black mirror reflecting her own pale, terrified face. Ranger Thompson stood by the door, a silent guardian. "I haven't watched them," he said, his voice gentle. "I felt that should be for you to do first, if you choose." He gestured to the laptop. "The files are on the desktop. Just click when you're ready." Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. Her entire life, her past and her future, had converged on this single terrifying point. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, she reached out and touched the trackpad, the faint click of the button echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. The first click opened a folder of photographs, and for a heart-stopping moment, the past was alive again. The images were vibrant, full of the crisp golden light of that autumn morning. There was Leo, grinning, pointing at a distant mountain peak. There was Mark, his arm around his son, his face a portrait of paternal pride. Sarah's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat as she traced their smiling faces on the screen. She saw the world through her son's eyes, the photos slightly askew, capturing the simple joy of their adventure. Then the gallery's tone began to shift. The sky in the background of a photo of Mark grew darker, the light flatter. The smiles became more subdued, replaced by expressions of concern. The final photograph was blurry, taken from a low angle, showing only Mark's back as he stared into the dense, darkening woods. She clicked on the first of 2 short video files. The image was shaky, the audio dominated by the howl of the wind and the crunch of boots on the trail. Leo was filming, his small voice barely audible. "Dad, I'm cold." Mark's voice answered, strained but reassuring. "I know, buddy, not much farther." The camera panned, and Sarah's heart froze. A third person was there, a man, dressed in dark hiking gear, his face obscured by a hood. He was gesturing down a faint, unmarked path. Mark seemed hesitant, but the man was insistent, his voice a low murmur beneath the wind. Sarah watched as Mark finally nodded, turning to follow the stranger into the trees, placing a protective hand on Leo's shoulder as the camera bobbed along behind them. The final clip was only 17 seconds long. The camera was on the ground, pointing up at a chaotic canopy of swaying pine boughs against a swirling gray sky. The audio was terrifyingly clear, Mark's voice, sharp with alarm. "What is that?" "We're going back." Then the stranger's voice, no longer friendly, but chillingly calm. "You saw it. You can't." A grunt of effort, the sickening wet thud of something heavy striking flesh, and a choked cry from Mark. Then Leo's scream, a sound of pure terror that was abruptly cut short. Silence. The video ended. The screen went black, reflecting Sarah's face, a mask of utter devastation. The wilderness hadn't taken them. A monster wearing a man's face had. The agonizing void of not knowing was gone, replaced by the white-hot, razor-sharp certainty of murder. The silence that followed the final truncated scream was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the small office. Sarah sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the black screen, where her son's final terror had been displayed. The reflection showed a stranger, a woman hollowed out by a truth more brutal than any horror her imagination had ever concocted. Ranger Thompson, who had discreetly re-entered the room, stood frozen, the color drained from his weathered face. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache for 4 years was gone. In its place, something new and terrible ignited, a cold, crystalline rage. The wilderness was no longer the villain, it was just a stage. The real monster had a face, a voice, and had walked away, leaving her family's story buried under a blanket of snow and lies. The investigation into the disappearance of Mark and Leo Jenkins was officially reopened, but its designation had changed from missing persons to homicide. The 17-second video clip became the ghost haunting a nationwide manhunt. Sarah, once a recluse, defined by her loss, transformed. She became the public face of the investigation, her interviews radiating not sorrow, but a chilling, unwavering resolve. The website she had maintained as a lonely vigil became a command center for justice, the fuzzy, hooded image of the killer its stark banner. She worked relentlessly with detectives, her memories of Mark's meticulous planning, and Leo's boundless curiosity providing context and clues. Her pain was no longer a weight that held her down. It was fuel, propelling her forward with a singular, terrible purpose, to find the man who had stolen her world. Months later, Sarah stood in a quiet cemetery far from the shadow of Yellowstone's peaks. 2 simple granite stones marked the earth, engraved with the names of her husband and son. There had been no bodies to bury, only memories, but the certainty of their story allowed her finally to create a place of rest. The ambiguous loss that had held her captive for so long was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean lines of truth. She no longer scanned the horizon, hoping to see them walk out of the trees. Her pilgrimage was over. As she placed a large, perfect pine cone on Leo's stone, a promise she had never forgotten, the grief was still there, a permanent part of her soul. But it was joined by a quiet strength, a resolve as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves. The search was over, but the fight for justice had just begun.